Welcome to Module 13, where we're going to be talking about something called a two-factor ANOVA. Last week you learned about the analysis of variance procedure, or ANOVA, and this week we're just extending it out a little bit to talk about what it would look like if we had two factors or two independent variables. Let's take a look. So before we get started, as you go through this unit, you're going to need your ANOVA formulas for sums of squares and degrees of freedom that we talked about last week. You'll also need to have your F distribution table at the ready. So in this video and the next two videos, we're going to talk about the logic of a two-factor ANOVA, and then we're going to talk about something called main effects and interactions in the next couple of videos. So ANOVA that we learned about last week is a single factor design. And factor is another way of saying independent variable. So we were working with a single independent variable that had three or more levels or three or more groups, if you will recall. But it was one independent variable that we were looking at. And that, again, that independent variable had more than two levels. And very often we just say more than two treatment conditions. So, for example, we talked about the room temperature having three different degrees. So we had a room temperature of 50 degrees, 70 degrees, and 90 degrees. Those were three different treatment conditions, but it was one independent variable, room temperature. But this week, we're going to talk about how sometimes a researcher wants to know how two independent variables will affect a dependent variable. So not just one independent variable, but two. We call this a factorial design. You're going to want to make sure you write that down. And we're going to be talking this week about what's called a two-factor ANOVA, or an ANOVA that has two independent variables. So we're going to examine how each independent variable impacts the dependent variable. That's one thing that we can do. We can do this individually. So we look at how each independent variable operates on its own with the dependent variable. But with the two-factor ANOVA, we also can examine how both independent variables impact the dependent variable collectively. In other words, together. How do the two independent variables work in concert to affect the dependent variable? So when we talk about our factors, each factor has different levels of the independent variable. So if we look over here on the left, we have factor A, and factor A has level 1 and level 2, or group 1 and group 2. And then over here we have factor B that has also two levels or two groups, level 1, level 2, or group 1 or group 2. What this produces for us is a matrix that combines the different levels of the factors together. So we have basically in this study 4 different groups. The first group is a combination of A1, B1. So level 1 of factor A and level 1 of factor B. The second group here are people, maybe we'll say people, that are in the A1 group but also in the B2 group. And that's a unique group of people, A1 and B2. And then in the third group, we have level 2 of the A factor, A2, but B1. And the fourth one is A2 and B2. So basically what we're doing is we're taking the different levels of two different independent variables and putting them together. We're going to have lots of examples of this, so just keep this in mind. So these independent variables are used to create a matrix. Each combination of factor levels creates a cell. So when we talk about a cell, we're talking about the individual boxes here. So this is the A1B1 cell, this is the A1B2 cell, etc. And the type of matrix that we're looking at defines the type of design. So this is an example of what we call a 2x2 design, because there's two levels of factor A and two levels of factor B. That's a 2x2 design. Now, if I had 3 levels of factor B, it would be a 2x3 design, but it's not. This is a 2x2 design. 2 times 2 is 4, and we have 4 different cells. In the next video, we're going to get very specific with something called main effects.